This 9-year-old dystopian Netflix thriller is perfect for Squid Game fans. Squid Game has been a phenomenon since it premiered in 2021. While there's no denying the South Korean thriller's high quality and masterful execution of its ideas, said ideas aren't all original. Several other countries produced series with similar premises long years before Squid Game's first season was released, with one of the most notable being the Brazilian drama 3%. Squid Game wasn't the first dark critique of capitalism filled with deadly games to premiere on Netflix, with 3%'s first season having hit the platform 9 years earlier. The dystopian thriller depicts a future where the Earth has been mostly ravaged, and only 3% of humanity is able to earn the right to leave behind the squalor and struggle of inland and enter the seemingly utopic offshore. The method by which every 20-year-old is tested will be familiar to any fan of Squid Game, as the process is composed of a streak of death games. 3% blends familiar elements of Squid Game with science fiction. 3% primarily follows Michelle Santana, played by Bianca Comparto, who begins her journey by undergoing the process, hoping to discover the fate of her older brother, Andrew, who disappeared after going through the process and secretly working for an anti-offshore resistance group, The Cause. Competing against many other hopeful candidates, Michelle finds a friend and ally in Fernando Carvalho, played by Mitchell Gomes, a wheelchair user whose father is a religious leader preaching to the people of inland that society being separated by the process is the natural order of things. They're also joined by the quiet but capable Joana Coelho, played by Vanessa Oliveira, the selfish and shady Rafael Moreira, played by Rodolfo Valente, and the famous Marco Ilvares, played by Rafael Lozano, whose family is famous for always successfully completing the process. Before the games begin, all the participants are introduced to the head of the process, the devious and slimy Ezequiel, played by João Miguel, who acts as the main antagonist for the first season. Whereas the death games in Squid Game are all based on traditional Korean children's games and activities, the challenges faced in the process are much more varied. Several of them aren't even death games at all, and the majority of contestants are simply sent home, forced to live with their failure, with no hope of ever escaping poverty. Working individually and in groups, depending on the challenge, Michelle and the other hopefuls are faced with interviews, various forms of puzzles, a trek through a dark tunnel filled with hallucinatory gas, personalized forms of torture, and just like in Squid Game, the circumstances of the process being used to make the participants turn violent against each other. Thrilling and tense as the challenges and helpful as they are for moving the story along, the real meat of Season 1 is what the games expose about the participants and what their existence has to say about both the world of 3% and the real world that it exists to comment on. Michelle's heroic aspirations are proven to be naive as she comes into direct conflict with Ezequiel. Fernando rises above everyone's expectations of him by thriving more in the process than he ever did in the real world. Rafael is revealed to be an additional mole for the cause, and while Marco initially seems like a noble leader, his true savage nature comes out the instant his sense of privilege and entitlement are challenged. 3% is very obviously about wealth and equality, but it digs more into the sources of its perpetuation than Squid Game does. The existence of the dystopian status quo wasn't just formed out of greed, but by the hoarding of the limited resources that remained after the rich and powerful had already wrecked the planet's ecosystem. There is no class solidarity among the inlanders because the system they live under makes them all see each other as competition from the moment they're born, just as modern-day capitalism does. Disabled people like Fernando are thrown under the bus and seen as having no value because they're deemed as unlikely to complete the process. Religious leaders make people believe that the process is just and fair in the name of achieving greater power and influence for themselves, and even the sole resistance group against offshore, the Cause, are shown to be corrupt, cruel, and only out for themselves, with later seasons revealing it was initially founded not out of a sense of heroism against this world's extreme form of capitalism, but because the daughter of offshore's founders failed the process and wanted revenge for being left on the inland.